It was all my mother's doing. Watching her on a sun lounger, pulling a series of faces, each one more extreme than the last, as if the pages she were reading were slapping her every time she turned them. I recognised the name on the front of the book. Of course I did. He was the first writer I'd ever connected with, admired for what, in adulthood, one would call his voice. A boy does not talk about books or writers in that way. He just knows what he likes. And I liked Roald Dahl. More than liked. Adored. The mischief, the danger, the wickedness. First it was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which had communicated more to me about the brutal experience of poverty than every Blue Peter appeal combined. Then on to the savage grotesquerie of James and the Giant Peach, and the alarming moral violence of the Magic Finger. But here I was, 10 years old, and my mother was reading a book by Roald Dahl. Not a children's book. I could tell that much from the black cover, the tiny typeface, and the bleak title, Kiss, Kiss. "What is it?" I'd asked, intrigued. "Oh, it's not suitable for you," she'd said. Well, that was enough of a lure to keep me going. "Why not?" "Because it's horrible." But the fact she kept on turning the pages told me it couldn't have been that horrible. "What kind of horrible?" She put the book down, gave me a dark and delicious look. "It's about a brain," she said. "A brain with an eye." Well, of course, that was it. I was just going to have to read it for myself, even if that meant stealing it from my mother's bedside. Which I did. Her brief summary barely did it justice. The story, called William and Mary, was about a terminally ill philosopher, persuaded by a neurosurgeon friend to take part in an experiment in extending life beyond physical death. The philosopher agrees to the removal of his brain from his cranium, along with one of his eyes, and the subsequent transfer of the organs to a tank, where they'll be kept alive apart from his body. Things go rapidly downhill for him from there. My next run-in with these adult stories came a couple of years later in 1979. There was much trumpeting of a new television series about to begin on ITV, Tales of the Unexpected. I was buying my own books by then, so when I saw the tie-in edition, with its lurid red cover lining the shelves at Smith's, it was a compulsory purchase. Oh, how I was hooked. I devoured it in one go. They weren't just unexpected, these tales. They were like perfect jokes, with fantastic punchlines. Or even better, magic tricks whose mechanics were so beautifully concealed that the surprises at the end seemed to arrive from nowhere. The intricacies of their construction, however, were a secondary pleasure compared to the stuff of the stories themselves. That single eye tethered to a still-living disembodied brain in William and Mary turned out to be the perfect flag for Dahl's adult kingdom. For me, the macabre pleasures to be found within these stories were a delightful progression from the delicious unpleasantness I already knew from his children's books. For Dahl, the progression came the other way round. He began his career with these adult stories, first published in prestigious periodicals such as The New Yorker and Harper's Magazine in the 1940s and 50s. As I read them, I found myself transfixed by the often creeping sense of dread, which, while never veering into the supernatural, was defiantly rich and strange. There was the queasy Georgie Porgy, whose unfortunate hero seems to get eaten alive at the story's end, though it can only be a figment of his imagination. There was the blackly comic Pig, whose vegetarian hero is introduced to the pleasures of eating flesh, only to find himself on the menu at the finish. There was Royal Jelly, where a pregnant woman who's been fed the titular substance by her apiarist husband throughout her term delivers a child described as being like some gigantic grub. Each of these scenarios crawled under my skin, burrowed into my imagination, and set up a permanent and fruitful home there. Within a few years I'd be writing my own stories and dark comedy sketches, whose worldview, I would be the first to admit, was encouraged by what I'd encountered in Dahl. I was fortunate, a few years ago, to be given the chance to spend more time with these wonderful stories. I was commissioned by the Lyric Theatre Hammersmith to adapt a selection into a play. The best thing about the whole process was that myself and director Polly Findlay were treated to a visit to Dahl's home in Great Missenden and allowed to spend some time in his writing shed, which lay a short walk from the house at the bottom of the garden. The place was the stuff of fable itself. I already knew much about it, but actually being there was another thing entirely. One immediately felt the presence of the man in amongst all the odd details, perfectly preserved, though he himself was missing, like the crew of the Marie Celeste, ground-out fag butts still screwed up in his ashtray. Amongst the items much written about elsewhere, the piece of his hip bone removed after an operation, the huge ball of silver paper collected from a lifetime of chocolate wrappers. Perhaps the most telling for me was a small piece of yellowing newspaper in a frame on the wall. One had to peer at it to see what it was. A clipping from the Sunday Times bestseller lists, with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory at number 1 in the children's book chart. Any writer would recognise the emotion that led to the cutting out and mounting of that fragment, a glimpse of the human being around whom the icon is now wrapped. For it's no secret that Dahl thought himself underappreciated in his own lifetime. Few and far between are the artists who feel otherwise, and be of no doubt that Dahl was an artist of the first order. This was brought home to me later in the process of getting the play on. Ironically, perhaps, I was struggling with how to end it, and having been working non-stop with the cast, crew and director for a 10-day stretch, I returned home to Yorkshire for a brief respite and some time with my family. My eldest daughter was 5 then and on a Dahl kick. Sitting down to do bedtime stories, I said she could choose what she liked since I'd been away for so long. My stomach clenched when she asked for The Witches. At that point in the proceedings, the last thing I wanted to see was another word of Dahl. Until I started reading. By the second page, I was completely hooked, and when we got to the point where Dahl reaches out to the listening kid to suggest that his own teacher might be a witch, all I could think was, God, this is just brilliant. The fact that such a thought could even enter my exhausted, Dahl-addled head told me everything I needed to know about his abilities and his quality. Of course, his children's fiction is hardly uncelebrated, but I think there's an unspoken secret about Dahl's adult short stories. Writing about Alfred Hitchcock, the American academic Mark Crispin Miller lambasts the faint praise Hitchcock was so often tarnished with in his lifetime, always described as the master of suspense. Miller says this is a bit like referring to the painter Turner as the seascape whiz. Dahl, too, was often diminished as being the master of the twist in the tale, as if this were all the stories were doing. But if that were the case, once the twists were known, there'd be little reason to return to them. And yet I would read them again and again and again. Yes, the sickening inevitability of their climaxes was part of that, but I was enjoying so much more. The sly black humour, the vivid locales, the brilliant characterisations, the same pitiless x-raying of flawed humanity that I cherished and recognised from his children's books. In short, he was a great writer whose utter accessibility, clarity and lack of pretension would deny him a literary status in his own lifetime. It's no surprise that Hitchcock himself was a Dahl fan, and an early adopter too. He produced adaptations of no less than 6 of the stories for his own TV series, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, all prior to the appearance of Dahl's first children's book. Ultimately, much as I relished the process of adapting the stories, I remain convinced that the best place to enjoy them is on the page. Nothing is as delicious as the experience of reading The Landlady for the first time. I certainly want to remain spoiler-free, so for anybody listening who hasn't read that story, I shall avoid giving anything away. Let me just say this. The balance struck between what we're told about the hero's fate and what's left to our imaginations is so perfect that it would be impossible to reproduce that effect in a dramatised form. A testament to Dahl's exemplary taste and almost musical ability with the rhythms of storytelling. I think, though, it's Dahl's morality that ultimately makes the most impact on me. At first glance he seems flippant, insouciant, spitefully unserious. The apt endings, like those doled out to the naughty children in Hilaire Bullock's rhymes, which Dahl much admired, are light-heartedly appealing. The exquisite pain suffered by the shifty antique dealer in Parson's Pleasure, who dresses as a priest in order to better con those he buys from, is as pertinent as the fire and brimstone rained down on the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the stories are often full of such wish fulfillment, and sometimes something worse, a reflection of a mind that was seared from a young age by the truth of the Buddhist dictum that to live is to suffer. For all the fitting nastiness, if it was nastiness alone that drove these stories, then they'd hardly be worth bothering with. But it isn't. The truth is that there's a hidden heart beating away beneath the blackness, a yearning for justice, for fairness, for righteousness, a strong moral centre that finds its analogue in Dahl's own response to his unfortunate son Theo's hydrocephalus. Injured in a car accident, the child needed a shunt installed in his brain to help the fluid drain while he was healing. The thing didn't work, so rather than just accepting this or railing against it, Dahl helped design a better version with an engineer friend. The resulting device, the Wade-Dahl till valve, was used for many years afterwards, benefiting thousands of other children. The world can be awful. It can also be improved, and we can be part of that, if we get off our arses and do something about it. Of course, sometimes Dahl's characters get away with it, and that can be just as enjoyable. And of course in life, sometimes people do get away with it, or seem to get away with it. And here lies Dahl's great value. He spoke the truth. Not superficial platitudes, but hard truths about what we're actually like, rather than how we might want to be, and the nature of reality, which is pretty brutal sometimes. Hence the Old Testament, which I keep coming back to. To get to somewhere better, you have to begin by seeing clearly where you are. Dahl showed us that all right. Poor old Job might have recognised the fate of several Dahl characters as being not unlike his own. Looking back now, I'm amused to find my fascination with William and Mary, that very first adult story I encountered my mother reading, remains undiminished to this day. It occurs to me what an apt metaphor it is for the writer's lot. A detached brain, with a lone observing eye, surveying the world around it. Perhaps from a shed at the bottom of the garden, rather than a tank of saline solution. But looking and observing, occasionally flashing with fury, just as William's eye does when his long-suffering wife exhales cigarette smoke right into his exposed, vulnerable pupil. Perhaps what's most impressive and most unusual about Dahl is that he was a writer with two careers, one after the other. Everybody knows about the second one, but the first deserves equal celebration. What a singular brain, and what a penetrating eye.